Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing logistics, supply chain, and all those things that we're thinking about as we get into the gift-giving season. And to provide some insights on all of this, today we've got Eric Johnson, who's Senior Technology Editor at the Journal of Commerce, which is another part of the broader S&P Global Market Intelligence team. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Eric, so glad to be here. Really excited. And yeah, it is the season where most people start thinking about logistics and supply chain. Maybe the only time all year they actually do that.
Well, it is, and especially given the last 2 years, or now kind of coming up on 3, depending upon how we're counting. It really is that thing in which supply chain has gone from something that we didn't really consider. I think most folks thought about how things got from here to there, but it had never really been a big concern. But here we are. I'd be curious, what do you think's different about this year, and what do you see contributing to it?
Yeah, certainly what you just said is absolutely the truth in terms of something that used to be kind of the underground or behind the walls kind of plumbing of global commerce, the actual physical movement of raw materials and finished goods that was very obscured from the view of most people who are not involved in this industry, started to be, surface in a way that it never had before, sort of that cliche about the tide going out and exposing everything in a way that kind of the general population, right, had started to see how the sausage was made.
That Warren Buffett quote, which is great, and but that's a great analogy, because it really was all of this stuff that was quite literally below the surface, I think, for most people. Especially when you start thinking about raw goods, all those things were feeding these pipelines. It really was something that wasn't really even in consideration for most people.
Yeah, and I think, you had asked what sort of changed this year versus last year, or even if maybe we take it back to pre-pandemic, right? I think there's a broader understanding of the complexity and the length of time that it actually takes to get goods to the store shelves or in an online, kind of storefront for us to buy. So that general understanding is a lot stronger. I do think that, human nature is that when there's a problem, it gets a lot of attention. And when the problem recedes, we sort of stop paying attention and you move on to another thing that deserves our attention. So my feeling, and I think we're starting to see this play out a bit, is that the fascination with logistics will probably recede a bit, and I think it already has. I think this year the issue is much more about inflation and spending power and retail discounts as we head into the holidays, much more than, I can't get the thing that I desperately wanted to buy, whether it's a new appliance or a sofa or a toy for my child, right? Those considerations are sort of a lot less this year, and now it's more about spending power and am I going to time it right so that I get the maximum discount for the item that I want to buy. So that to me is the biggest fundamental change.
But you point out that really interesting point, which is that the urgent part has shifted, but yet there still are supply chain impacts on that. That what you were just identifying, which is the how do I time when I'm going to buy this? There's all of this supply chain dynamics that are still shaking out because of long delays. Retailers were buying, inventories stacked up, and now we get into this triangulation of people trying to figure out, how much of inventory is backed up, how much a retailer is going to discount, all these kind of things, which we're now sort of, I guess, trying to interpret second order functions on supply chain now. So yeah, it's changed a lot in terms of our focus.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting to think about for me is, we're very focused at the Journal of Commerce. We're very focused on the sort of supply demand picture on capacity from ocean-going vessels and trucks and intermodal rail and aircraft that are moving freight, right? So we're thinking about the supply-demand picture as it relates to the providers of that capacity. And that picture has completely shifted from even 6 months ago, where there was a lot of constraint on capacity. There was too much volume moving, too much volume of goods. And that's completely flipped now. And part of it is what you said about the inventory. We've read all about this, right? Retailers have too much inventory. They order too much, expecting this demand to kind of permeate through the rest of 22. Or even if they didn't, they just didn't want to be caught out by the kind of capacity constraints that they saw last year. So they decided that it was better to have a little bit too much inventory rather than not have enough and miss out on sales. So that's coming home to roost a little bit right now. They face the same issues, right, that we as consumers do. When is the right time to buy? When is the right time to replenish? If I decide the right time to replenish is a particular month, but capacity to move my goods from Asia to the US is constrained, then all of a sudden that decision that I made that was optimal for me isn't optimal for the whole market. So I think one kind of analogy that I sort of go back to is there's this sort of common pool of capacity that the world all is accessing. It's sort of like a public pool, right? Like we can all jump into it if we want to, but if 10,000 people are in that pool, it's not ideal. But each individual company has its own sort of needs.
It's going to get a little crowded.
Right? And so it's how do those individual needs map or overlap with that common public pool of capacity, right? So it's a super challenging industry and probably more complex than people give it credit for, even as they've understood it a little bit more.
Well, as you're pointing out, a lot of this is perception, which is people trying to figure out, how long will it take me to get this? So yeah, I've got a supplier who can actually provide it, but yet I've got to figure out how I actually physically get stuff to where I need it to be. That whole dynamic also seems to come into play, much like market perceptions, driving macro activity. A lot of these different things that happen to be in play. I guess one of the things that you also cover, and I want to look into in a bit, is that I think for most of us, okay, we've figured out, hey, supply chains are important, but there's a lot of technology in logistics, more so than I think most consider. We seem to only see it and understand it when it breaks. We've seen some high-profile cyber attacks, things like the Colonial Pipeline attack, certain shippers that fell victim to ransomware. I'm curious about the deeper story about the technology and what you see are the innovations that are changing logistics.
Yeah, well, do you have a week? There's a lot going on. Maybe
we do this in 4 or 5 episodes, right?
This is literally where I spend 99% of my time. So obviously have a lot of thoughts. So it's interesting that you said that there's more technology than people might realize. I think within the logistics industry, there's a perception that logistics is sort of behind other industries. And in terms of developing and adopting technology. And my view is every industry thinks they're a little bit more behind the curve than they actually are, except for the few industries who think they're way ahead of the curve, and they're probably not as far ahead of the curve as they think they are. Everyone is actually probably somewhere in the middle, more than they realize. And as an example, if you talk to someone who's in international air freight, they will say, oh, we're so antiquated. I wish we could get to the point that the U.S. trucking industry is in. And you talk to someone in the trucking industry and they say, oh, we're still doing this by email and paper. I wish we could get as sophisticated as this other mode, right? So everyone kind of thinks the grass is a little bit greener. But you're right. There has been a huge sort of influx of software development into the logistics industry, both the domestic supply chains and international over the last decade. I've had one one founder in the space has sort of called it the Cambrian explosion of logistics technology over the last decade, and a lot of it fueled by venture capital and growth equity in the private equity sector. So it's interesting because there's been previous waves of technology into logistics, and I sort of think of it in three waves. There was the pre-dot-com era of mostly kind of ERP-based development of supply chain tech that didn't really influence logistics, which meaning the physical movement of freight. It was more about connecting with suppliers and placing orders and having the finance, component associated with that. And then post.com, when the internet started to reveal itself as a real conduit between different dispersed organizations, you started to see a huge influx of technology that was web-based and cloud-based and priced on a subscription basis versus some big honking, license fee that had to be paid upfront or in major installments. And so that was the second phase. And then in 2010, post the financial crisis, we saw sort of the VC-fueled, real startup app self-service phase of logistics tech that's still, very early. It's really sort of in an embryonic stage, even a decade into it. But there is adoption and there's better understanding of the power that some of these tools can have, even if they focus on a small segment of the industry. So it's interesting from my perspective because I'm sort of sitting across the top of these three phases, all bumping into each other and sometimes working really well and sometimes not playing nicely together. And the reality is the biggest and most used technologies in our logistics are still Microsoft Outlook and Microsoft Excel. So the biggest incumbent to unseat for all of these technologies is still email and spreadsheets. It's fascinating.
Well, I mean, isn't it always sort of a certain amount of lowest common denominator that, you've got to coordinate across, we see this in tech all the time. You've got to coordinate across, very disparate sets of market participants. And you fall back to that one thing that you can really count on. Hey, at least it's not fax, right?
Well, it's interesting you say that. You still hear people talk about getting faxes a lot, sending faxes, as well as AS400s, which are these green screen monitors from like the 80s that evidently some companies still use. I think it's more of an apocryphal thing at this point because I've never been in an office that still has a green screen.
Oh, don't you blaspheme in here. Those AS400s are near and dear to my heart. Come on. All the time I spent with Kick systems and stuff. Oh, great, powerful systems. Well, and at this point, getting a little long in the tooth. But again, I think it's so often we tend to think that organizations can just simply move directly from what they've got. But of course, if you're running a business on these systems and it's getting the job done, there's a lot of risk in terms of making this jump. And I thought it was really wild that you mentioned the Precambrian explosion. That's actually a term that William Fellows and Gina Telsek use for our cloud infrastructure, the population of cloud infrastructure companies that are out there in that ecosystem. So it really seems like we've got some parallels in terms of just this massive expansion of a whole set of different approaches that are trying to solve what are some really complex problems, but from some very different angles.
The cloud adoption period, which was really kind of in the mid 2000s, where companies in the logistics industry were sort of getting to terms with the idea that it was okay to work on a browser-based system rather than an on-prem, kind of clunky system that they were used to using. That seems a lifetime ago, but there was a period, in fact, when I first started reporting on this industry where, that was kind of the dividing line. Is like, do we trust a system that's cloud-based? Do we trust a system where we don't like physically have the servers in our facility? And it's still the change management you talked about, right? Which is an overused phrase, but it totally exists. is probably still the biggest roadblock that providers in the industry face. But the realization that really early providers in the space, so talking like early stages of cloud, early stages in the dot-com boom, where they saw logistics as the perfect industry for like a decentralized kind of platform that was accessible by a huge number of entities that weren't in the same organization. That is now, we're starting to see the fruition of that, or that come to fruition 20 years later. Because if you sort of step back and you take away the adoption and you take away the aversion to change kind of issues, it's hard to find an industry that's more, where cloud is more applicable than logistics, where, you have maybe 30 different organizations touching a single shipment. Some of them are in a direct commercial relationship with one another. Most of them are not. Some of them are governmental organizations that have to, ensure that a certificate has been filed and that the good is allowed to be exported and imported. And there's big global organizations and very small, sometimes 5-person organizations that are touching a shipment. I mean, what better place than the internet to connect all of those people, right? And it seems sort of ridiculous to even say that out loud, but that's still that's a big change in mindset for an industry that has sort of been built on a little bit of opacity, because the less that's sort of out there and transparent, the easier it is to kind of show that you're doing something valuable that you can get paid for, essentially, which is why there's 30 organizations that are attached to a shipment in the first place.
Well, and that gets into that situation where if you have opacity in markets, that's the technology disruption story forever, right? It's the how do you start to pull back the curtains, identify what's really valuable, and streamline some of those things that were really hidden in a lot of those transactions and those ecosystems.
Most definitely. So logistics is sort of I think the crux of the industry is its reliance on what are called intermediaries, transportation intermediaries. So this is a huge basket of different types of companies that all fall under one umbrella called intermediaries. That could be a freight forwarder or a customs broker or a truckload brokerage or an intermodal marketing company. I mean, there's literally 24 different monikers for all the companies under that umbrella. The thought, I think, for most technology providers is, wow, do we really need 8 intermediaries involved in between the buyer and the seller of the good? Some cases, yes. Some cases, no. Technology is sort of like the private investigator that's been hired to figure out which of those providers are essential, which are non-essential, and which sort of are not adding any value but are just there because something was hard to do, but technology could maybe make it easier to do. So we're still in that big kind of like investigative phase, big picture, where providers are figuring out what they can do to replace intermediaries and what they can't do to replace intermediaries. And there's, frankly, from the start of this last phase that I talked about, there were a lot of VC-backed companies that came into the market thinking most, if not all, of the intermediaries could be replaced. And I think most of them have figured out, no, actually, a lot of them provide a very valuable role, but it might be very niche, and some of it may be automatable, and part of it is not. And so that's the investigation that's sort of ongoing across the entire industry.
It's everybody's favorite technology term, disintermediation, or whether or not it works or not. It seems like a really interesting market to be in the midst of this transformation. And speaking of disintermediation, we're in the middle of Amazon's AWS reInvent event this week. And actually, when this podcast goes live, when people will be listening to it, it'll actually be the week after, but it is certainly top of mind. But there are things that you've been writing on that actually are talking about Amazon changing logistics. Is it doing the same kinds of things in logistics that in the same way it's impacted IT?
Yeah, well, I think, part of that event this week, they've unveiled sort of a supply chain platform that shouldn't be news to anybody in our industry anymore. They've been making incremental kind of moves across a number of those intermediary categories, by the way, that I had mentioned earlier. So that, freight brokerage and international freight forwarding, and a segment of forwarding called non-vessel operating common carrier, or NVO, if we want to get really wonky, and customs brokerage, and so they've made all these incremental kind of moves, and what they announced today is stitching together a lot of that to help non-retailers actually primarily kind of manage inventory flow on a global basis, and uh, I think, if I step back and think about Amazon and what Amazon is trying to do. By the way, that was the AWS that announced that, not necessarily Amazon, which has
Yeah.
its global logistics arms. But if I step back, there was a very prescient article that a technology founder wrote about Amazon and its moves into logistics, and correlating them with what they did with AWS. And the thinking was, Amazon takes line items that it pays for to run its own business and says, which of these can we get so proficient at that we can turn it into a service that we can then sell one by one, right? And obviously, you know, server hosting, all that horse left the barn a long time ago. It's everyone knows it's a huge proportion of Amazon's profits. I think they saw similar opportunities in logistics a long time ago, and how logistics focused their core business was at that time, at least the marketplace and retail business were. And they've certainly decided that this is a market that they can Amazonify, to create a terrible word. And we're seeing those incremental moves, right?
I'm sure it's been used before.
Yeah. Well, the one difference is that AWS was going into a market with a lot fewer players. It's a much less fragmented space than global logistics is. And that fact has sort of befuddled a lot of companies that thought that they could get a dominant share of this market. And interestingly, we mentioned Amazon and AWS, but there's another. The week prior, Microsoft announced a similar sort of supply chain suite that it was releasing, sort of combining a bunch of its products, including things like Power BI and Outlook and Teams and things that a lot of companies use every day. So there is a sort of swarm of activity around the kind of big tech providers that are looking to sort of own a big chunk of this space, but it's not an easy space to own, even for the biggest names in the industry.
It takes a lot of work to get people out of using Outlook and Excel spreadsheets, right?
For sure. And frankly, you mentioned before, I refer to it too. There's three generations of technology that various companies have adopted. If they were advanced at the time and they're a little behind the times now, it's difficult to get people off those, right? I mean, they work well enough. They may not be, optimized for omni-channel order management and distributed order management and inventory optimization and all these fancy terms that we come across in supply chain. But, they work well enough, and the people can kind of fill in the cracks for where they don't work. And it's hard to just, to sort of transform an entire business in the way that a lot of these software providers sort of envision it happening.
And a transition is always difficult. But it is one of the things that you're going to be talking about at the TPM Tech Conference. It's coming up in February. I guess that and a bunch more. Can you give our listeners some details on it?
Yeah. So everything that I write about and talk about with literally hundreds, if not thousands of people over the course of the year sort of culminates in this conference that you referred to called TPM Tech, which is February 23rd and 24th in Long Beach, California. It's a standalone event, but it's associated with a very long-running event, the 23rd year, called TPM, which has been based in Southern California since its inception. Biggest container shipping, biggest global logistics event in the world by far. So TPM Tech, we started earlier this year in 22. And so the one in February will be the second version of it. And it's really about giving people in the global logistics industry a space to explore how technology is impacting them in a much more kind of immersive and comprehensive way than we're able to at TPM, which is much more about kind of the operational aspects and the economic outlooks of how the global trade environment looks. So TPM Tech is all about the nitty-gritty of, kind of investing into systems, integrating them with existing systems, mixing a niche piece of software from a startup with a big piece of software that you've had for 25 years, figuring out which categories of software are actually moving the needle. So for me, it's kind of like my Super Bowl, and we're going to have something on the order of 25 to 30 sessions. Another element that we're adding this year that's really interesting for me is we're doing what we're calling TPM Tech DevCon, which is going to be a little forum for the developer, engineer, kind of product communities to kind of get together and scrum and kind of work on common challenges that aren't necessarily, competitive between companies, but where we can kind of lift the entire industry as a whole by getting over those common challenges that would help, speed adoption and reduce the friction that exists in the industry.
Oh, wow. So really working at both sides of that ecosystem, not only the end consumers of the technology, but the developers on the front end.
Definitely. And the other element of TPM Tech is partnerships. We see a lot of partnerships between technology providers and logistics providers who are sort of aiming to be seen as, providers of technology to their customers as well. So we see a lot of partnerships flourish between those entities at the event as well.
Oh, wow. Well, we will include a link to the conference in the show notes for our listeners who can check that out. But this has been great, Eric. Many thanks for all of the perspectives, particularly at a time of year when it's front and center, I think, for most of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to help anyone kind of understand the space a little bit more. I can't help expedite your holiday shipping if that's the case. I don't get any special favors on that side of things. I'm still struggling with shipping delays just like everybody else. So, but yeah, thanks so much for having me, Eric. It was great to talk.
Well, and it sounds like there's a lot more to talk about. So I'll have to take a marker to have you back as we start working through a lot of the complexities of what is a really interesting market and one that certainly affects all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to come back.
Well, thank you very much. And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright and Ethan Zimmon on the marketing and events teams, and our studio lead, Kyle Canilosi. I hope that you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be heading back into the customer experience extravaganza. Cheryl Kingstone is going to be back. We'll be talking about one of the other parts of the holiday season. Hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.